Social media and political life can be a minefield with retaliations, lies, and conjecture. We've been seeing this in this run up to this May 2023 election, but the tactic to silence opposition is not new and seems to have intensified over the last number of years. Our guest today had controversy thrust upon her when she was running in the 2019 Alberta provincial election. Caylan Ford had been a star candidate for the UCP in a Calgary riding until she was labeled a racist and was declared guilty in the court of public opinion, and in very short order was cancelled. She claims nothing could be further from the truth and that it was all a setup. Now, a documentary sharing her side of the story has recently been released called When the Mob Came. Take a look at this.
Controversy surrounding a United Conservative Party candidate has caused her to step down.
Yes, Caylan Ford has resigned as a UCP candidate in the riding of Calgary Mountain View after a report claiming she echoed white nationalist rhetoric.
What was shared was her private messages. She was engaged in a Facebook chat with somebody.
The accusation was that she had said something in a private conversation that had echoed the words of white supremacists.
Caylan Ford says those Facebook messages were taken out of context.
The statement did not have one word of contrition, apology, or backing down from those statements.
The NDP has now started running attack ads framing the United Conservative Party as intolerant.
I was utterly shocked to hear of the comments that that candidate, who was of course a star candidate for the UCP, made.
Racism and homophobia and things like that. If you can paint your opponent as one of those things, they just become toxic and they can't be touched. But all's fair in love and war, right?
The UCP as a party has a problem with racism.
I had text messages appear on my phone saying Caylan's a racist. I'm like, what? That's not true. And then I saw the Press Progress story.
Caylan Ford is under fire after an article from Press Progress. The outlet is linked to the NDP-affiliated think tank Broadbent Institute.
So I remember asking myself some questions saying, did I get that wrong? Could I have misjudged it? This is nothing at all like what I would have expected of Caylan Ford.
This is either the strangest white supremacist I can imagine, or there's just something more going on here.
Her own private messages that are expressing a nuanced view on a contentious social issue are what are used to end her political career. Are you kidding me? Nobody is safe.
Caylan Ford joins me now. Caylan, welcome to Bridge City News. Great to have you on today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, so Caylan, as painful as it might still be, can you take us back to that time when the accusations arose? What happened exactly? What was the conversation that kind of started this firestorm?
Sure. So I was running in the 2019 provincial election as a United Conservative Party candidate in a real swing riding. So it was a constituency that Conservatives hadn't won in 20 years, and I was running against the then Justice Minister for the NDP, as well as the leader of the Liberal Party. And yet polls showed, as we got closer to the election, that it was very much a toss-up. Our internal polling showed I was on track to win. I assume the other parties had the same polling. And under those circumstances, the NDP there's an organization called the Broadbent Institute, which runs a quasi-media outlet called Press Progress. And this is effectively the opposition research mill of the NDP. During the election, it was very aggressively putting out negative stories about Conservative candidates. And in that way, these stories would be able to sort of move into the mainstream. And so a month before the election, less than a month actually, the night before the writs drop, Press Progress published an article claiming that in a private conversation years earlier, that I had, in their words, echoed the rhetoric of white nationalists and complained that white supremacist terrorists are treated unfairly. Now, the record of this private conversation was never publicly disclosed. I did not have it, so I couldn't effectively refute these accusations at the time. As it turned out, I now know from litigation that they did, in fact, deceptively edit and redact the excerpts of this private conversation that they published. And they framed it in such a way, this is right after the, you may recall the Christchurch Mosque massacre, where 50 people were killed at prayer in New Zealand. And so right after this massacre, they were suggesting that I sympathized with terrorism effectively. And that wasn't true. I had a background in studying counterterrorism and international security studies. I was actually talking about how to more effectively deal with radicalization. But that was sort of torqued in this article. Within 4 hours, my party had asked me to resign. It was national news by the next morning, and it remained national news through the duration of the election. And by the end of that, I was basically left completely socially isolated. People were afraid of being seen with me in public. No one would hire me. No one would even talk to me. And so it was a profoundly isolating experience, after which I was basically left with no way of earning a living for several years.
So this was a private conversation, I'm assuming in like a direct message, maybe on Facebook or something. Okay, so obviously you know the person that you were talking to. So do you feel that there were people close to you or that were involved in this attack on you? How would they have gotten a hold of that conversation?
Well, so that's this is very much part of the story that's told in the documentary, and it's a story that's so convoluted that it takes a feature-length documentary to tell it. But the other party was a fellow who I had met years earlier in political circles, who was interested in running for office, and I think had felt sort of spurned that he was not really having the success that he thought his talents merited in politics. And as a consequence of that, he went out on a very elaborate campaign over the course of an entire year to try to end my candidacy, and did that with numerous false accusations. He had accused me of fraud, tried to plant stories in the media about me committing fraud, had filed a false police report claiming I assaulted him. And none of that gained traction. The thing that gained traction, because it sort of reflects the nature of, what are the current really controversial debates socially, was the accusation that I sympathized with white supremacists somehow. So that's what ended up terminating my candidacy.
Wow. Okay. So, well, maybe to an outside observer, it could seem like these accusations came swiftly and suddenly. So, from your point of view now, do you see this as a coordinated attack, or do you think it was just him on his own?
I very much believe that there was a great element of collusion here that's been borne out in the court record. So I actually had to get a restraining order against this person. That restraining order was only very recently upheld by a trial judge, and that decision actually led to the recognition of a new tort of civil harassment in Alberta. So this is kind of the thing that you don't see when you see the headlines, is that there are layers and layers behind the story. And in this case, I think the truth was much stranger than the fiction that was concocted. But yes, I have alleged in a defamation claim against the NDP and Press Progress that this was very much a result of deliberate planning and collusion, that they were planning this for several months, that they decided to release this story right before the writs dropped, because that's when it would do the most harm to my candidacy. And a trial judge seemed to agree with that assessment as well, that was deliberately planned to maximize the harm that it would cause me. So it was not in a matter of legitimate public interest. It was about a sort of calculated attempt to destroy a person's reputation for political gain.
Okay, so you did receive a victory in court there. So, and since then, you've created a documentary about this incident, as I mentioned in the intro. So why did you choose to do this?
Well, I found myself in the aftermath of this in a very difficult position. As I said, employers wouldn't engage with me because I was seen as a reputational liability, right? If I have an unusual name, if you Google me, everything that you would find was headlines accusing me of basically being a white supremacist. So that's not something that employers want to be associated with, that charities or that any sort of philanthropic cause wants to be associated with. So on the one hand, I couldn't earn a living. I also couldn't find a news outlet that was willing to give me a platform to tell the real story of what had happened here. A few journalists tried. They found themselves on the receiving end of threats, I believe an extortion attempt. Danielle Smith, who was then a radio host, she had me on air. She was the only person who interviewed me in a public forum. And after that, she was subject to a boycott campaign orchestrated by sort of NDP affiliated actors to try to force her to apologize, to drive her off the air. The mayor of Calgary was apparently supporting the premise of this, telling people they should boycott her show, just for giving me an opportunity to defend myself against false accusations. So after that, no one would give me a platform to tell the story. And that interview was pulled offline by her employer at the time. So what I did have, I didn't have a background or a way of earning a living. I had a background in documentary filmmaking, though. I'd just recently won a Screenwriters Award for a feature documentary, and I'd recently made another one as well. So I had done documentaries on mostly focusing on totalitarianism in China, censorship, mass persuasion under totalitarian regimes, propaganda, and scapegoating mechanisms and how that works. And so I think this equipped me fairly well to be able to tell kind of a cancel culture story that touches on some of the same themes, albeit in a different form here in Canada.
Interesting. Okay, so maybe share with us that process of creating that documentary and what it did for you personally.
Well, so we began production. I was very fortunate that the team that had actually been doing video with me and with the United Conservative Party during the campaign, they had all this footage of me. So I reached out to them and said, would you be willing to go on this sort of crazy adventure? And I'm very grateful that they agreed. So we have had this great store of sort of contemporaneous material, and we're able to tell the story. Now, I should say it's kind of horrifying making an autobiographical documentary. To me, it feels like the height of narcissism. It's a lot of emotional you see in the film, there are some very raw, very emotional moments. That's uncomfortable for someone like me. I'm quite introverted. So on the one hand, there's an element of horror at that. But
you're introverted and you are running for public office.
It was a weird combination. I like people, though, despite being introverted. I like, the one-on-one conversations and getting to know people is actually very interesting. But when I was campaigning, oh gosh, I hated seeing my face on flyers or my name on signs. It was sort of at a deep level. I was so embarrassed by self-promotion. So this film is challenging, but I will say that there is something cathartic about being able to share an experience of suffering and have other people see it and understand it, and possibly to connect on some level. And that's what I've been hearing from people so far, is that this film, at one level, is about cancel culture. It's about Alberta politics. There's a lot of very familiar faces in this documentary if you follow Alberta politics. But ultimately, what it's about is, I think, perennial questions of sort of ultimate concern about how we should live. And the sort of central argument I'm trying to make is that actually suffering is not necessarily bad for a person, that there is some redemptive value and purpose in it, that it can afford us greater perspective and an ability to connect with other people in their suffering as well. Yeah. And that actually what we should most fear is we should be afraid of doing injustice to others rather than suffering it ourselves. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my thesis with the film, and I hope that resonates with people, irrespective of sort of where they fall on the political spectrum or whether they follow Alberta politics or not.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you've been hearing from viewers so far of your documentary. I know we are kind of living in that age of cancel culture right now, so I would imagine it has happened to a number of people. Has anyone reached out to you yet? I know it was just released recently, wasn't it?
Yeah. I've had a lot of people reach out and say that it spoke to them because many people have gone through something kind of analogous, probably not to the extreme degree that I did, but I think for a lot of people, they've said that this brought them back to what they experienced and actually helped them make sense of what they went through. And again, human beings, we're social beings. We need other people to sort of see us, to understand our experiences. I think we're driven to share our deepest experiences with other people. And so at one level, I think that's what this sort of does for people. And for others, I've been very heartened that a number of people watched it and reached out to apologize as well, which is
really
not something that I was looking for, but I will admit that it's a very kind gesture, and even if it's sort of 4 years after the fact, it's very welcome.
Yeah, and I mean, it was an opportunity for you to, I guess, really tell your side of the story. Do you have anything pending legally in court still over this?
So yeah, there were 2 court actions that arose out of this. One was an application for a restraining order, and that, as I said, I was granted one. It was violated. And so I recently had to go to trial. The restraining order was upheld, and And this individual who was behind these allegations was cited in contempt of court as well for violating that order. Parallel to that, I have a $7 million defamation suit pending against the CBC, the Toronto Star, the NDP, Broadbent Institute, Progress Alberta, and a number of other actors who were involved in this defamation. So we're hoping to conclude discovery by the end of this year. It's a very drawn out process.
Okay. What does this experience say to you about the media in Alberta and Canada? Have you given up on it totally?
Well, have I given up on? Oh, I certainly. One of the things about seeing how a topic that you know very well is depicted in the media is that it invariably erodes your trust in the media, and that's never more the case than when the media is reporting about you. I had to watch, basically unable to respond. I had to watch national news outlets speculate for months about the kind of person I was, about what my motives were, about what I thought, without an opportunity to speak for myself.
And nobody reached out to you to ask you what?
Well, that's a long story, but
sure it is.
Yeah, essentially, I don't believe that there were any sincere efforts made on the part of the media, who were provided with lots of material from me, many statements and offers to speak, and those were not pursued. So but it has also freed me of ever believing any negative story I see about anyone else. So, my default now, if I see a story about someone who's accused of something in the media, is to recognize I don't have enough information to form a judgment about that person. This reporter probably doesn't have enough information. And I have a certain amount of sympathy for reporters because newsrooms have largely been hollowed out. They're working on tight deadlines. It's easier not to ask questions. It's easier to just sort of accept a narrative as it's presented for you and turn around some copy and get it on the wire as soon as you can so that you don't lose the opportunity to capitalize on the story. But that's a limited sympathy, I suppose. But yes, I would say to treat negative stories with extreme skepticism and to remember that it is a virtue to be able to view others charitably and to withhold judgment when we don't have enough information about a situation.
Caylan, thanks so much for your time today. Where can people view this documentary?
So if you go to whenthemobcame.com, you'll be directed to a website and be able to follow the links to find it on, to be able to purchase it through Vimeo.
Caylan, thank you so much. We're out of time, but thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
That was Caylan Ford, former UCP candidate and a documentary filmmaker who joined us from Calgary.